Chugaevka Air Base, Soviet Far East, September 6, 1976, 12:50 in the afternoon. A group of MiG-25 interceptors rolls down the runway and lifts into a gray Siberian sky. Routine training flight, multi-aircraft formation. Everything looks normal from the ground. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko follows the flight plan for the first few minutes. Then he doesn't. He breaks formation, noses the aircraft down, and descends to 50 feet above the sea surface. At that altitude, Soviet ground radar loses him completely. He turns east. He is now flying one of the most classified aircraft in the world, alone, at near supersonic speed, 50 feet above the water, toward Japan. His squadron thinks he reported engine trouble. His base thinks he turned back. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, one of the most sophisticated military radar networks on Earth, have no idea where he went. He has 400 miles of open ocean ahead of him, a single map of Hokkaido folded in his flight suit, and enough fuel, maybe, to get there. The man who climbed into that cockpit didn't decide to do this overnight. Belenko was 29 years old in 1976, a lieutenant in the 513th Fighter Regiment, 11th Air Army. The Soviet Air Defense Forces were not the regular Air Force. They were a separate elite branch tasked with defending Soviet airspace from American strategic bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. To be assigned to the MiG-25 program was not just a posting, it was a statement of trust. Moscow was saying, "We believe in you completely." What Moscow didn't account for was what the posting actually looked like on the ground. Chugaevka Air Base sat 120 miles from Vladivostok, closer to Japan than to Moscow, surrounded by cold Pacific weather and deteriorating infrastructure. Morale was poor, facilities were inadequate. Belenko raised these problems with his superiors more than once. He was dismissed each time, not argued with, not reprimanded, simply ignored. His home life was worse. His wife had told him she was filing for divorce in October. She would take their young son back to Magadan. That was not a conversation, that was a schedule. He had been thinking about leaving for a long time. Now he had a reason to stop thinking. What made Belenko dangerous was not his anger, it was his knowledge. Western intelligence agencies had been tracking the Foxbat, their name for the MiG-25, since 1967, when reconnaissance satellites photographed early prototypes at a Soviet airfield. What they saw alarmed the entire NATO defense establishment. An interceptor capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3, a service ceiling approaching 90,000 feet, a radar system that could lock onto targets no Western aircraft could outrun. The United States Air Force redesigned procurement plans around this single threat. The F-15 Eagle program was accelerated specifically because the Foxbat existed. Billions of dollars in spending, an entire generation of fighter doctrine, all of it built around an aircraft no Western engineer had ever physically examined. Belenko knew exactly what the MiG-25 actually was. He also knew what the Americans would give to find out. He spent months preparing. He studied maps of northern Japan, memorizing the location of Chitose Air Base in Hokkaido, the closest military airfield he could identify. He calculated the MiG-25's fuel consumption at different altitudes. The aircraft was extraordinarily thirsty, and the math left almost no margin for error on a 400-mile ocean crossing. He worked out his flight profile. Low to the deck to escape Soviet radar, then a climb near Japan to make himself visible before anyone decided to shoot him down. He tucked the aircraft's pilot manual into his flight suit. He intended to hand it over in person. On the morning of September 6, the base flight surgeon checked his blood pressure before the training session. It was elevated. Belenko said he had been exercising. The flight surgeon believed him and cleared him to fly. The first problem came almost immediately. Flying at 50 feet above the Sea of Japan for 400 miles was not a technique designed for comfort. At that altitude, a small navigation error means the water. He had no radar contact, no radio communication, and no way to verify his position except by dead reckoning and the folded map inside his suit. The MiG-25 burned fuel at a rate built for short interceptions, not ocean crossings. With every mile east, the margin thinned. Then, the weather closed in over Hokkaido. Belenko climbed when he neared Japanese airspace, rising to nearly 20,000 feet to make himself visible on radar and avoid being treated as an incoming threat. Japanese controllers spotted him immediately. They launched two F-4 Phantom interceptors from the 302nd Tactical Fighter Squadron to intercept and escort him. The cloud cover made it impossible. The Phantoms searched. They couldn't find him. He was completely alone. He had planned to land at Chitose Air Base, but the weather had made navigation nearly impossible, and the MiG-25's fuel was now critically low. He was not going to make Chitose. He found the civilian airport instead. Hakodate Airport, southern Hokkaido. A regional airfield with a single runway 9,843 feet long. For a fully equipped MiG-25 traveling at landing speed, that was not enough runway. He knew it wasn't enough. He came in anyway. As he lined up his approach, a Boeing 727 was beginning its takeoff roll on the same runway. He cleared it. The MiG-25 touched down, deployed its drag parachute, and still overran the runway by 790 feet before stopping just short of a localizer antenna. Belenko climbed onto the wing. He fired 2 pistol shots into the air. Japanese police were already running toward him. He announced that he wanted political asylum in the United States. The next 72 hours were unlike anything the Japanese government had faced since the war. A Soviet frontline interceptor, not a trainer, not a transport, but an active classified warplane, was sitting at a civilian airport in southern Hokkaido, while passengers photographed it from the terminal windows. The Soviet Union demanded its immediate return. It claimed Belenko had gotten lost. Then it claimed he had been drugged. Then it claimed he had been coerced. The demands changed every few hours, each more urgent than the last. Japan was caught between 2 superpowers at once. The Americans wanted the aircraft studied. The Soviets wanted it back. Japan wanted the entire situation to disappear. On September 7th, Belenko was moved to Tokyo. On September 8th, US President Gerald Ford personally granted him asylum. He was on a Northwest Airlines flight to the United States 2 days later. The MiG-25 stayed in Japan for 6 more weeks. American and Japanese engineers dismantled it at Hyakuri Air Base north of Tokyo and cataloged every component. What they found rewrote the threat assessment that had shaped Western air power policy for a decade. The aircraft weighed 64,000 pounds fully fueled. It was built not from titanium, as analysts had long assumed, but primarily from stainless steel, robust, cheap, and extremely heavy. Its Mach 3.2 top speed was a structural limit, not a practical capability. Push the engines past Mach 2.83 and they would come apart. Its true service ceiling was closer to 79,000 feet, not 90,000, and reachable only briefly without a full weapons load. The radar was powerful, but unsophisticated. The cockpit instrumentation was years behind comparable Western aircraft. The aircraft that had driven an entire generation of American fighter development was, in the hands of engineers who could finally examine it, a machine built to shoot down high-altitude strategic bombers, flying missions that had already been retired. It had been designed for a threat that no longer existed. George H.W. Bush, then Director of Central Intelligence, called the opportunity an intelligence bonanza. The Soviets received the aircraft back in November 1976, shipped in 30 crates from the port of Hitachi aboard a Soviet cargo vessel. Japanese engineers billed Moscow $40,000 for crating services and runway damage at Hakodate. When Soviet technicians opened the crates at Vladivostok, they found 20 components missing. Neither bill is recorded as having been paid. For Belenko, what followed was quieter than what came before. He was debriefed by the CIA for 5 months. He worked as a government consultant for several years. He became a US citizen, changed his routines regularly, and gave almost no public interviews. The Soviet Union circulated stories about him for years, that he had been arrested, killed in a car accident, returned to Moscow. None of it was true. Belenko knew better than to correct the record openly. A man the KGB still wanted was a man who appeared in newspapers. The F-15 Eagle, the aircraft the United States had rushed into production specifically to counter the Foxbat's assumed capabilities, turned out to be vastly superior to the threat it had been designed to meet. American engineers had over-engineered a weapons system against an enemy that didn't exist at the level they feared. The F-15 went on to become one of the most dominant air superiority fighters in aviation history, accumulating a combat record across 4 decades with a kill ratio that remains unmatched among modern fighters. It won by defeating a ghost. Viktor Belenko died on September 24, 2023, at 76 in the United States. He lived quietly for 47 years under terms he negotiated on the wing of a stolen aircraft at a regional airport in northern Japan, in front of tourists with cameras. The Soviet Air Defense Forces never publicly acknowledged what his 400-mile flight had cost them. They didn't need to. The engineers who opened those crates in Vladivostok already knew.